Hi there, my name is Nicholas Orr and this is Synchronization is Not a Product. So this is a session I first did back in 2016 at DevCon in Las Vegas, and I've since done it again in Sydney at our Developer Day here in May of 2017. I think it's a topic that needs to be discussed a bit more widely, so I think it's interesting enough for me to record it and hopefully a broader audience gets something valuable from it. You may know me already. I'm the developer of a couple of tools that you may have heard of. We do base elements. We have a base elements plugin. We have Refresh FM, and we have REST FM, which is a REST API for FileMaker Server, which was the starting point for us getting into sync. So why am I talking about sync? Well, sync is big. Sync is everywhere. It's coming up as a topic a lot. It's an interesting and complex topic, and yet in spite of that, it should be something that appears very simple to the end user. When done well, everything should just work. We have a sync framework that we've done, so we built a sync framework on top of a REST API using our REST FM product, and I wanted to do a session about at DevCon about being a FileMaker heretic, about going against the conventional wisdom. So I think this is an example where I'm pointing out some things that other people believe and saying, no, look, I think there's a better way. So that's that last one. I have ideas. Yes, thank you. You are the perfect audience. So hopefully you fit this category, that you've done a little sync, or you've thought about it, you found it to be a hard problem, you wanted FileMaker's help to solve it for you, and perhaps even you stopped doing as much sync because it was hard. So looking through what's going on in the FileMaker world around sync and what is the problem that we have. There's a lot of these sorts of feature requests. Sync in the background, a sync for a solution that's offline. Note that it says here though that sync gets to be a complicated topic very quickly, and I'll get back to that. A request here for background sync. A request here for a built-in FileMaker to client syncing. So these are all things that I would describe as FileMaker should create a sync script or a sync function or a sync button or a sync magic unicorn. So the idea of this session, I actually think these topics and these feature requests are wrong. I think it's a bad idea for FileMaker to try and implement them. I think there's plenty of examples of other people who've tried and failed, and I think there are much better solutions for FileMaker. So I think it's really valuable for you to understand why it's a bad idea and how you can then go about implementing sync in your solution in ways that work really well for you and for your clients. So before we get to that, I want to skip over some things, reiterate some things that I think better understand what I mean by sync and what things aren't sync. So the standby server built into FileMaker Server, for example, there's a product out there called Sync Server Pro, which is essentially keeping two servers in synchronization. And there's ways that you can use other products, things like Mirror Sync Server, to sync server to server. So all of these things are having two systems that are essentially exact matching copies of the entire data set at any one time. So in that case, these things aren't sync. It's replication, it's backups, it's standby servers, it's server failure overrides, it's scalability, it's redundancy. These are things that aren't sync, and we shouldn't call them sync. So I'm not referring to those particular things. In that case, what is sync? The perfect example, the canonical one, is the FileMaker Go offline user model. You have one or more data sources, so FileMaker Server may be a data source, but there may be other things as well. You have periods of no communication between the two, in spite of the fact that data's been added and edited and modified and at any time when there's no communication. And you have periods when you catch up on those data changes. And even more than that, there are clients, or there's possibly even servers that have separate data sources. So no There is no universal set of data that all exists all in one place at the same time, and that's okay. You can have some data in some server and some in another, some online, some on a web service, some in lots of different places potentially. And that sort of idea is a good description of the iOS and FileMaker Go offline user model. So this request about sync that FileMaker should just do for us. There is an example of it out in the world. You may have heard it. This is done by, it's called iCloud Core Data. It was Apple's attempt to do set it and forget it sync. So you store the data using a built-in data framework, and then you tell the OS that you want it kept in sync, and the OS does the rest. This sounds like a great idea. You just store it and then tell the OS keep it in sync. I was actually listening to a podcast and I found an actual iOS developer talking about this. His name's Marco Arment. This was on the Accidental Tech podcast. He, in terms of establishing his credentials, he came to fame as one of the original developers on Tumblr. He left that to start an Instapaper, an iOS app that did sync. He sold it. He created a magazine app and sold that. He created a podcast app now called Overcast. He hasn't sold that yet. His podcast app does sync. So I have 3 OS devices that have Overcast on them. It keeps everything in sync. It works brilliantly. There's nothing that I need to do. So iCloud Core Data, he looked at and he attempted to make use of, but he never used. Here's him talking about it.
iCloud Core Data tried to do the crazy thing of like, just give us access to your local database and we're just going to make it sync and we're just going to make that work. That could never work. Like things are more complicated than that. It's not that Apple did a bad job of implementing that. It's that the entire idea was deeply flawed from the start. That was never going to work well.
I think it's interesting to note what he actually doesn't say. He doesn't say their implementation of it didn't work. He says the entire idea of leaving sync up to the OS is wrong and it will never work. So if you're listening to anything he says you don't want FileMaker to do sync for you. So if you leave listening to this session, this video, and you've learnt one thing, I hope it's that. But I will explain what I mean by that a bit more though, so keep listening. Apple's replacement for iCloud Core Data was called CloudKit. So let's just hear him talking about CloudKit.
CloudKit, the reason why people like it so much better is because it's designed in such a way that it is kind of like a web service that you interact with that notifies you on changes, and then you, locally in the app, do things like resolving conflicts.
Yeah, you can still make your own infinite loop.
You're still writing the hard stuff. You're just not running the servers. But like you're still writing all of the tricky, complex sync logic in the app. And that's true of any of these services because sync is just hard. And there really isn't a generalized sync library that just works for everybody. Like if there was, sync wouldn't be hard.
A couple of things in that is he says this tricky, complex logic. It's like he almost says it in a positive way that you should own that tricky, complex logic, and that there is no universal sync library because sync is hard. So I'll get into what I mean by sync is hard in a sec. But the takeaway from that is that you need to own your own process. And I don't mean by that you have to write your own code. You can still certainly use someone else's tool, whether it's GoSync, whether it's MirrorSync, whether it's my product, REST-FM Sync. Whichever platform you use, whether it's someone else's code or your own, you have to have a deep understanding of what it's doing in your solution, how you're going to use it, how you're going to configure it, and all of the use case examples. So just getting sync installed and set up is just the start. Really integrating into your solution in useful ways takes the work, and that's the core thing you need to do with sync. So why is sync hard? If you think about what's going on in a solution, clients can create records and delete records at any time. Every other client needs to know when you've done these things, but every client has their own set of priorities about what data they need, when they need it, and how soon things can happen. And no two clients ever connect. You can't rely on scheduled connections from any client. They may be offline for days or weeks at the end, but then within all of those restrictions and limitations, you still have to apply the business rules. They still have to be able to follow business rules. An example of that might be, for example, that if you have someone going out and sending out invoices, that you receive payment for an invoice before the invoice even exists. So for example, you have a user with an iPad and they create an invoice, they send the client a PDF, and before that user's synchronized that invoice back to your accounting system, you receive a payment online, and the payment comes via your online accounting package, and then is hooked straight into the database, and the database then says, hang on, we have a payment, we have no invoice, how does that work? So the business rules still need to apply, but they need to apply in ways that really need to change to consider the fact that you've got offline users. So as an example, why should you be doing this complex logic? Why should you be doing that? Essentially, you need to think about those hard things and then take control of that. So every solution is different, every client is different, even every sync session is different. So when you're syncing it at a particular time on a particular day, what you're syncing then and there might be different from what you sync when you do the user does the exact same steps the next day. Depending on what you're doing, depending on what the user's doing, depending on what's happened, every sync session should be different. And only when you control the logic and control the process can you actually deliver things for them. So as an example of how sync gets complex, we had a client that asked for a simple form capture, basically just a list of questions. The users submit the forms, they capture signatures and questions, and it should be very easy. Yeah, it was. Our first implementation of it was exactly what it is. It's not even really sync, it's just submitting form data, so it's really just creating. So you push data from the clients to the server, and that's about it. That was really simple to implement in the first place. And then they said to us, no worries, now we need admin staff who can see everything. No problems, we can do that, so they can pull everything off the server, no problem. Then we need a state admin who only needs to see their own state. Okay, no worries, well, we need to put some criteria into their sync, and they only need to sync what they can see. Not a worries. Then we had a different user who was coming in and taking over an old user's territory. So they needed to be able to see history on their old record, but the old user also needed to be able to see their own stuff and not others. So they needed to be able to see what they'd created previously and then new ones, but the new person needed to come in and see new things. So there was this whole business logic. Now it started to get a little bit interesting about what was syncing and when. After a while, they accumulated lots and lots of records and lots of forms. So the syncs for someone coming in or shifting location or a new admin person, they started to become time consuming. So we looked at what was going on, and mostly this was down to images. Images are, sit them down to signatures, because the signatures is just an image. So syncing all the images meant that the sync took about 50 minutes. So if we take out the images and only load the images on demand, we reduce 50 minutes down to about 2, because it's really data. So that was the first easy step that we could do. What else can we do? Okay, well, let's reduce the history for users. So they don't need 3-4 years worth of history. They only really need the last sort of 12 months. So we did that. So that reduced it down to about 30 seconds. That was really good for them. That pulled down all their data. They could load the images on demand, and they could load historical records on demand. Then we had admin users. So they only needed they're not going to look at everything all the time. They're going to be able to want to see a form and see its status and see whether it's been done. But they didn't need all the questions and all the signatures and all the other details. So they could only load admin. So they wanted to be able to see just the form details, no questions, which was great. And that meant all of the remaining questions were just load on demand. So a load on demand was really almost instant. You know, there were 40 odd questions for each record, and they could hit a button and see everything that they wanted to see within that. It was almost like a not noticeable delay. So they had a little portal which just showed their progress, and then for ones that they hadn't got all the details of, they had a download button. Except for the fact that then they said to me, oh, no worries, but we want to see progress for one that we haven't downloaded. I don't want to have to download it to be able to see progress. Okay. Sounds like a reasonable request. How do you do that? Well, the progress is just a count of how many questions they've answered. So that's an unstored calculation summing up the related records. So how do you do that in a FileMaker solution if you don't have the related records? Well, what you do is you create a calculation field on the server, and you sync that calculation field on the server to a stored number field on the client. So the client says then, if I have related records, use those. If I don't, then use the number field on the server, and that way you can display the progress bar for both examples. Think about where we've got to now. From a simple form push to the server thing, we've got multiple different data sets being synced at different times, a whole heap of load on demand, and a calculation field that syncs to a number field that doesn't need to be sent back to the server. So there's all sorts of different options that have gone in here, and this is a solution that has two tables. In a large complex business solution, and when you talk about what the users want and do things for what the solution requires rather than just keeping everything in sync, these are the sorts of things, and this is why sync gets hard. Just an example, another example, a salesperson out in the field. So we built a solution like this for a client. They used it offline, they go and visit a client, they take orders, they might have even done a live FileMaker Go connection in the past. So their system handles clients, invoices, orders, purchase orders, notes, staff, and timesheets. So this is a sort of reasonable solution. They just want to go out and create new invoices. So this example, I'm going to go through the details of what I think you need to do in terms of rethinking your sync. So that example, think about what do they need to know. What does each user need to know at any point in the day, any point in time, where they are? If they're getting into their car at the start of the day, what do they need to know? If they arrive at a client, what do they need to know? When they've finished up at the end of the day, what do they need to know? How much data do they need? Do they need to have every single instance of every record? Do they only need some history? Do they need to know today, this week, tomorrow, next week? Think about data structures and change. You don't have to have the same data structures at any point. Your data structures for a sync client might be different from the server. They don't have to be the same. Think about availability. Do you need everything? What can be made available on call? What can be dynamically loaded? And then finally, push actions to the server. So you can make the server do some of the work. That could be things like generating PDFs, reports, sending emails, updating statuses. So you might be doing perform script on server, but it also might just be queuing things and running things on schedule. And the last thing, the big one, most of all, don't call it sync. The problem with calling it sync in terms of what the users are doing is that it sets up expectations, and the expectation is that they have access to a universal, complete, and permanently accurate set of data at any time. My client is in sync with my server, and they are the same. That doesn't exist in the real world. So the nature of sync and the availability for perform sync means that shouldn't ever be the same. And if you call it sync, then you're misrepresenting what it is. So we can't do that, and you're better off not describing it that way to clients and giving them a false impression. I'll get to some good examples of that in a sec. So in that example number 2 of what they need. What do they need? That user going out to visit a client, he really only needs a jobs list. How much other information does he need? Well, he might need to know, for example, an invoice total. Again, that could be an unstored calculation on the server, but a number on the client. Perhaps there's a way for him to look at other things, when they last paid, but none of that information really needs to be there universally and picked up based on a whole set of tables that you pull down. So how much information do they need? Realistically, today's, maybe tomorrow's jobs, maybe the week planned in advance. They don't need the job they went to 3 months ago. They don't need the job they're going to visit in 3 months' time. So think about the dates that you're showing. Think about your data structures. Why can't you sync invoice data with the job record? So you could have something that amounts to a text field which says how much invoice they owe, how many invoices they've paid in the last 12 months, how many invoices are outstanding, how long it takes them to pay that information. And that's really part of the job or part of the client record. You don't need to pull down all of the invoice information to have that. That can just be stored data that you pull as part of the job, so that you're not having to sync all of the invoices, all of the items, and all of the payments and all the payment items in order to calculate that locally. So rethink your data structures there. Availability. They say, you walk in and you say, you still owe us $3,000. They say, well, no, we paid that last week. Well, show me the invoice, and then you can just pull it up instantly. You just click on the button and it loads that dynamically. So we can make those invoices pull on demand. We can make the PDF send on the server. So we can have server actions that generate the PDF. I haven't got that invoice. Can you send it to me again? Hit a button. Yeah, no worries, done. The server will send you another copy of that invoice. So you don't have to pull the PDF down off the server and re-email it and type it in and do all the things. You just send a request to the server to say, send me that email. So, you know, a statement, for example, that can be the sort of thing you do. And the last point, don't call it sync. How would you do that in that example? You might have an update job list. You might have a submit button on a new invoice. You might have a view button in an invoice portal. You might have a send statement button at the top of the job. None of those things say sync, but they're much more useful to what the user's actually doing, what they're thinking, and what actions you need to take. Submit jobs, update, view, send statements. Think about the actions. Don't think about calling them sync. A couple of technical things you can do as well in terms of making your sync much simpler. Take advantage of what FileMaker gives you. So you get current time UTC milliseconds is your friend. Time zones are awful. They need to know the limitations of clocks and computers. There are trade-offs. There's changes in daylight savings. All of that goes away when you use UTC milliseconds. You can still have local time fields, but whatever you're doing for sync, must use that UTC, and that takes away a whole lot of problems that you don't otherwise have to have. Use UUIDs only. In solutions where you're tracking things by ID, UUIDs has the advantage that it's unique, not just in one table, but across all tables. You really need to think about deletes. And for example, you have a user out in the field who creates an invoice and then deletes it before it ever gets sent to the server. Perhaps you can delete it. No worries. But once you send it to the server, then there's the possibility that a whole lot of other clients then have a copy of that invoice. So how do you delete in that situation? So it's actually much more complex than just being able to delete records. You need to really reconsider what you're doing. There are two ways to manage deletes that I think are useful. Either to have a flag field, so a user never deletes a record on the server maintains the original record, but it's flagged as deleted, and so then the clients can access that flag and say delete my local copy. The other way is to have a table for deletes and to track deleted records, and so they then pull down the list of deleted records and then use that to reference any local copies that they have. Either way, you need to maintain data for deletes, and it's fundamentally different to the way we've had deletes working in FileMaker solutions before. Reconsider logins and users. So for example, a user that logs in over the top, so an admin user logs into someone else's device. So you've got, you know, user A there, they've got all their local information, and then all of a sudden user B, who happens to be admin, logs in. Now they're going to need a different set of data, so you really need to think about what happens when a user logs in and what data do they get access to. And then lastly, this idea of building a dumb data store. This is something I haven't heard mentioned much before, but I think it's actually a really good idea when you're doing sync. What do I mean by that? It's a single file. It contains no scripts, no layouts, except for the ones you need to sync. No server-side processes, no auto-enter fields, no calculations, summaries, globals, nothing except the data. It can then run server-side processes, for example. But the reason for that is the logistics of managing a database that has to be sync data and local data. It gets really, really complex. So some of the issues are the users are offline, so they log in on their own device and then they connect to the server. How do they authenticate to the server? Do they connect with their live account or do they connect with a sync account? So then, depending on what they do, what privilege model do they have on the server? Are there restrictions on editing records, for example? When you do auto-enter dates, so modification dates, lookups, that's all done on the client. You don't want to redo those on the server. If I've put an auto-enter date of today on my client, then I sync tomorrow, I don't want tomorrow's date as the modification date. So think about your complex auto-enters and lookups that might be happening on the server. Think about an invoice item that gets its lookup done based on what happens on the server when in fact the data on the client has changed and the lookup destination hasn't been synced. You might get items synced before products, for example. So all of that goes away with a dumb data store, and it means that you don't have to manage any of those conflicts. The advantage too is you can still run a server, FileMaker server copy that is a direct access copy, so live normal FileMaker networking connection. But it doesn't have to be the same database as your dumb sync database. They could be separate. You can have clients talking to your sync database. You can have FileMaker server syncing to your sync database as well. That avoids all of those problems and makes sync as simple and as single purpose as possible. So if you're building your own framework, what would you build? A basic sync framework. You get your last updated time. You get your list of local modified records since the last updated time. You get your local list of deleted records, however you've managed that. You check on the server for modified records, and then you update the server ones locally, checking the modification times, comparing with your own modified records. And then you send your remaining updates, because some of your local updates may have been overridden by the server updates and vice versa. You send your remaining updates back to the server. So the framework, it seems like it's very simple, 6 rough sort of steps. But our example, syncing with REST-FM sync, is about 500 lines of code in sync and our main sort of script. So it does get complicated very quickly. Tips and tricks, some things that we've picked up. Use persistent IDs to identify users. So that's actually really handy, even though the fact that it's not wholly persistent. When you delete FileMaker and reinstall it, you get a new persistent ID. It is really handy for being able to identify that this is a particular user. So you can use that to say, do I need to pull all these records off the server because I know they belong to this particular user? No, I don't need to pull some records off the server. Errors are tricky. Not all errors need explanation. So for example, if you've got a network failure, you just want to say try again later. You don't want to go into the complexities of what the network failure was and how it happened. Some things don't need big explanations. We need to allow for the fact that this is an error-prone environment. There are some things that need to be done on the server. So an example of that is generating invoice numbers. If you have a sequential invoice number, you can't generate them on the client because each client has their own sequence. So you need to be able to send an invoice to the server and get back from the server at the same time you send it the next invoice number as part of that. And maybe that needs to be done before you can generate it as a PDF or whatever it happens to be, depending on your process. Some things can be done on the server. So like I mentioned, generating PDFs. Think about what you could offload. Lastly, containers are big. Images are a massive amount of data. So compare that 2-minute sync to a 50-minute sync when you're just adding images into it. And there's tens of thousands of records in that. So containers are big. Separate them, push them out to their own table, use thumbnails where you can, and load them dynamically. So just to cover, rethink your sync. Think about your framework. Understand your framework. Don't expect to plug something in and have it just work. Adjust your data structures. Reconsider availability. Push your actions to the server. Don't call it sync. Think about it in terms of what the user's expectations are and what they're trying to do. That's it. Thank you. I do have one more bonus slide though, and this was something that I put aside but ended up showing in the sessions. And this is the idea of if these feature requests are not what we should be asking for, what should we be asking for? So what is it that FileMaker can do for us in terms of sync? We need more control over metadata for records. So we have at the moment, believe it or not, a little bit of metadata, which is a record ID, but it's also not persistent between records. If we export and then re-import, the record gains a new ID. We need some more unique metadata that we can have that's not part of the field data. Things like modification timestamps or unique IDs or even audit trails. So the audit stuff could be part of what's in the metadata. And then on top of that, we need ways to do bulk record modification. So an SQL insert with update. So there's ways in SQL to do things that say, update this record, and if it doesn't exist, create it as a new record. Those things don't exist in the current FileMaker SQL, execute SQL function. So there's those little things I think would make all sync frameworks better and make it easier to build sync into solutions and do sync in ways that really work. That's it. Thanks for listening.